Welcome again to the fourth Distinguished Lecture Series from KIOS. This is a continuation of the lecture we had yesterday by Professor Cassandras, and I would like to welcome him right now to give us a second.
Okay, thank you very much. So if you were in the other room yesterday, you heard me talk about decentralization. How can we take all these very complicated systems made out of networked agents and various points of interest, and how can we essentially impart autonomy, make the agents autonomous by decentralizing? Today, I'm going to focus on what we call the Internet of Cars. So it's a form of a multi-agent system. The agents are the cars. In today's world, they're not cooperating, so it's not easy to establish a decentralization since they're not, they don't want to cooperate among themselves. And by the way, these are us, the drivers. We are very selfish. We certainly don't want to cooperate with other drivers. But assuming that we create this new world of connected, automated vehicles, there's hope. So I'm going to try to tell you a little bit about what I think Internet of Cars means and how it fits in the context of what people call smart cities. And then I would like to draw this distinction between selfish and social optimality, which is actually something very standard that comes out of classical game theory. And there's a concept we call price of anarchy, which is associated with the fact that in most games, we operate as selfish agents, selfish players, and that's exactly what happens in transportation systems today. Every driver selfishly tries to get where he or she wants to go without really caring about other people. And that creates what we call the price of anarchy. So part of what I have been trying to do in the last few years is to quantify it, to measure the price of anarchy, so that then we can convince people that if the price of anarchy is high, it's worth moving towards these new technologies, which is precisely what these CAVs are, the connected, autonomous, or automated vehicles, which will allow us to reduce or eliminate the price of anarchy. Okay, so let's put this in the context of what we call a smart city, of which a big part is the transportation system. We can nowadays talk about smart cities as cyber-physical systems because we have established sensor networks which can now comfortably and cheaply collect a lot of data, process them to turn the raw data into information. This is where this buzzword big data comes in. So with all this big data, if you do your job right, then you can turn all of this information into decision-making algorithms through which you close the loop. And you take actions that make what we call a smart city. Of course, it's easier said than done because there's all these constraints or peripheral objectives that you also have to take into account. Now, the point I wanted to make here is that this, viewed as a dynamic system or a cyber-physical system, is really what we call a hybrid system. And once you take this point of view, then a lot of the mathematical techniques that have been developed for these systems come into play. What do I mean by hybrid system? I mean that this part of the system, if you think about it, has to do with the transfer of information. So this is where, that's the cyber part. That's where you talk about sensor nodes, communication, links, and information processing. And so this is the part of the system that you can model as a discrete event system, typically using models, mathematical models like automata, Petri nets, etc., etc. By the time you get here to decision making, in order to make decisions that can effectively act on physical objects like cars, then you have to bring in the classical physical systems, differential equations, models that look like that. So now this is really a physical part of the system. By the time you get back to transferring these commands now through another communication network back into affecting, actuating components in the city, you're back into a cyber component, and then at the very end, of course, the cars or whatever else, the buildings, the energy components have to operate in a physical basis. So when you put all of this together, you see that this is nothing but a hybrid system. Some of the dynamics are time-driven, some of the dynamics are event-driven, and in principle, we know how to control the systems. Right? Or at least we know how to model. Now, what is a hybrid, what is a smart city? I've just put up here a few definitions. I'm not going to go through them. This is just to show you that people have been struggling with an effort to define what a smart city is. Actually, I don't even know why we really care to define some of the best things in life we cannot really define anyway. But anyway, I told Christos that we will have all of these slides available, so if you really care to look at some of the details, you can take your time and look at them. I have singled, I wanted to show you this little movie here, because if you ask the question, what is a smart city? I think this movie tells you what is a smart city, or what a smart city should be.
Bring me a dream, they're gonna shoot it, but I'll never see. You'll have nobody to
So you can see there are no traffic lights here. All these are agents, and presumably they cooperate. And when I first showed this movie, maybe 3-4 years ago, I was very careful to tell people this is science fiction. But as of about a year ago, I don't say that anymore. I say this is real, can be done, except for the pedestrians and the bicycles. So if you eliminate the pedestrians and the bicycles, the rest we actually can do, and I hope to show you the fact that we are doing it today to some extent. Okay? So, everybody that I show this say, this is my hometown, this is my hometown. Everybody recognizes that. I would say I've seen this happen mostly in India, in my personal experience. Okay, so one last comment about the word smart, because if you're like me, you probably are sick and tired of hearing everything being attached to smart. Smart cities, smart phones, smart grids. So I want to say something which, to many of you, if you have a systems and control background like me, it's pretty obvious, but let me say it anyway. I want to emphasize that smart is not just collecting data. It is a necessary condition to being smart, but it's not how you should define smart. And here's an example from one of my pet projects, smart parking, where in this particular case, there are apps that tell you that there's a parking spot here, a parking spot there, but then you're left on your own, and maybe you'll get to this free spot, maybe you won't because somebody else has taken it later on, or maybe in fact, it's not even the best spot for you. So this is just collection of data. What really is smart is closing the loop, using the information, making some smart decisions, and then perhaps taking this car, delivering this car to this parking spot before anybody else through some sort of a reservation scheme, and also prove that this is the best parking spot for you. So good decisions and closing the loop is what makes things smart. And so when we talk about smart cities, that's the way I look at that. All right. Now, let's talk about transportation. This is the part of Commonwealth Avenue in Boston, Massachusetts. My office is right there. And this is a picture that shows you, it's a simulation, but it's posted on a Google map. It shows you this area right here, which is just an absolute mess. I'll return to that because that's sort of what we're trying to control with decentralized connected autonomous vehicles. This is an infamous traffic jam that took place in China. It was a 100-kilometer jam. Here it says enters day 9. I think it lasted about 12 days. This was just unbelievable, 100 kilometers. So question is, why? Why can we allow these things to happen? Even if we know, in theory, how to control a transportation network. What is it that makes this problem so hard? We've solved so many other problems. And I think there are two reasons. So the first reason is that there just aren't enough controls. If you think about a transportation system, there's traffic lights, there's pricing schemes through tolls and speed fines, but there's just not enough controls. So you cannot unleash the great power of feedback that we all know and love. The second reason is a game theoretic issue. Because as we drive, we're selfish and isolated, we don't know how the other drivers think, or for that matter, what their objectives are. Where are they going? Are they going to turn left, right? We are not communicating. And it's really a very elementary game theoretic fact that when players do not cooperate, or at least exchange some information, that leads to poor equilibria, very inefficient equilibria. And that creates this difference between what we call the selfish optimum and the social optimum. The gap between the two, it's actually not a gap, it's a ratio, is what we call the price of anarchy. So the starting point, perhaps, is to try to understand what is this price of anarchy, can you quantify it, can you measure it, and then how can you reduce it. So that's really the first step. And if you think about it, the hope to eliminate this price of anarchy is to go from selfish to social, meaning cooperation. And this is where these cabs come in. Because right now the cars don't talk to each other. But if they did, and if we took the human out of the driving loop, then in principle we should be able to automate everything, allow everything to cooperate with everything else, and we should be able to do things like that, like in the little movie that I showed you. Eliminate traffic lights, and then simply control accelerations and decelerations of cars so they flow all the time and they never stop, which is, by the way, the secret to solving the transportation problem. So that's what we call the Internet of Cars. A multi-agent system consisting of these connected vehicles and cooperating. And of course, if every car eventually becomes a cab, we can achieve that. If not, that's an interesting question. How many cabs do you need before you can reap the benefits of this automation? I'll show you a few preliminary results before the end of this talk of what we have done. Okay, so this may be obvious to you again, but I feel compelled to sum up the case for self-driving cars. First of all, this is a fact. Okay, 94% of accidents are due to human error. That by itself should be pretty compelling. Take the man and the woman out of the driving loop. Computers don't get distracted. Humans do. So you drive, you turn around, you rub your eyes, you look at your cell phone. Computers don't do that. Computers can process vast amounts of data. They love data. Humans cannot. Even if you put a lot of displays on my dashboard in my car, I don't think I can process more than 2 things at the same time. Computers can maintain steady cruising speeds, which is very important for energy efficiency. That sounds trivial, but if you look at a typical speed profile of a typical driver driving on a typical highway at typical speeds, you see this jiggly plot. We are apparently unable to hold a constant foot on the accelerator. So we oscillate a lot and we consume energy. Computers react quickly. Something, appears in front of your car. Yeah, maybe, you can do the right thing, but computers can do it better than you. Computers can make fast and accurate driving adjustments. Even if you do react, typically you react instinctively, but computers, in principle again, can make the actually best possible decision to avoid an obstacle, to brake, and so on. And finally, computers do not blink, they do not drink, and they do not sleep, and we do, and that brings you back to the 94% of accidents due to human error. Now, objections. Legal issues, depending on where you live, you have different laws, and this is one of the fundamental problems. Who's to blame when a car fails? How do we integrate with normal cars? I sort of mentioned that. Okay, even if we produce some of these cabs, if you only have 1, 2, 3%, probably that's not enough. So being smart in a society full of idiots doesn't buy you very much. Security and privacy, obviously, the minute you connect cars, these issues come in. I would argue that that's not unique to cars. Already we have the problem with our cell phones and our apps, the apps that we use. Accidents may be rare, but they will be bad. It's like airplane accidents. They don't happen a lot, but when they happen, everybody notices. And then there are technical challenges, which is where we come in, and this is what I want to tell you a little bit about. And obviously, the concept of decentralization is important because I'd like to delegate the intelligence to an individual car, which can take the right decisions without having to communicate with everybody else or with the cloud and all of that. So decentralization is important. Now, this is a picture that I will return to again. This is, again, as I said, the double intersection very close to my office. This is downtown Boston. Actually, not downtown, but sort of. This is what happens now with traffic lights. So you'll see that cars stop, like here when there's a red light. Here, we've taken the traffic lights out. We've used some of the techniques that I'll tell you about. And if you, I stop the simulation, but you can see there's congestion here, there's no congestion here. And when I return, I'll show you this again, and you will see more carefully. You'll see the trick is to control the acceleration of the cars. And so if two cars are coming, to collision course, one of them intelligently slows down, the other one goes through, and we never stop. And of course, you have to guarantee safety. That's paramount. But this is one of the, like I say here, the worst designed intersections in the world. I guarantee you that because I live it every day. All right, so first question is, how do we measure the price of anarchy? This is not really the topic of this talk, but I feel like I have to tell you a little bit about it so that I can motivate you about caps. So what we did is we worked with the city of Boston and the whole area around Boston. This is actually Boston. This is the greater Boston area. It goes up to about 30, 40 miles out here. And we were given a complete data set of minute-by-minute data, traffic data, over an entire year for about 13,000 road segments in this map. This is just part of a road segment so that I can turn this into a mathematical model, a graph. So this is a particular route, Massachusetts 62, and this is a link in my graph. So I can associate with a link a certain flow, and I can associate a cost function to that link under this flow. So the cost function typically could be the time that you take to travel through this link, but it could be other things like energy. All right? So under a user-centric, selfish control, there's a certain optimal flow, this one, which I denote with a superscript, which defines what we call an equilibrium. Right? Now, this equilibrium may not exist, but obviously it exists since we all drive and there is an equilibrium every day at every point in time. So it does exist. This is the system-centric equilibrium. This is the equilibrium that would result if I were able to control all of these flows through routing decisions, acceleration, deceleration, and achieve the truly optimal equilibrium flow that we call the social flow. Now, the reason why I defined this notation is so that I can define the price of anarchy. So the price of anarchy is this ratio. It is the weighted total cost, you can think of this as time, under the user, the selfish policy, divided by the one under the social policy. So it's always a number greater than or equal to 1. If we could get the price of anarchy to 1, we're done. So my job is now to estimate the price of anarchy in the greater Boston area and see, is it close to 1, in which case I don't have much of a case, or is it much greater than 1? So this is the before, if you want to think about it this way, and this is the after, so that you can go to the politicians showing them the before and tell them this is what, and this is what I could achieve in the after. So, let's work together, let's collect data, let's control. So there are really two goals here. One is how to measure this quantity, and then once I measure it and I find it to be large enough, how do I reduce it? Mathematically, the first part is solved, at least by us, through what we call inverse optimization. So inverse optimization is the standard use of optimization techniques, but rather than knowing the cost function and trying to find decisions or control to minimize or maximize, you start with the equilibrium that you know, and you try to estimate the actual cost function. So think about it. As you drive, you actually, presumably, optimize some cost function. Of course, you don't know what your cost function is, and I don't know either. But there must be something since there is an equilibrium. So if there is this equilibrium, can we find the virtual functions that correspond to this equilibrium? Because if we can, then we can take those, control them, and achieve the social. How do we eliminate this? Well, this is where I want to tell you a little bit about the optimal control framework that we have developed, and in particular one which is decentralized. So I'll go very, very quickly and show you just the results of this so that I can talk about multi-agent systems as a continuation of yesterday's talk. Okay, so very quickly, how do you estimate the price of anarchy in high-level terms. Actually, there's a paper that was just published that describes this work, and in fact, it is a special issue on smart cities that was just published in the proceedings of the IEEE. If you're interested in smart cities, one of the, yes, this is the advertisement for it. So this is what it looks like. You can get it. It just came up, and it includes very interesting papers on all aspects of smart cities. Some on transportation, some on energy, some on policy making, some on healthcare. I forget what else, but yeah, if you're interested, actually, this is the website where you can get to it. All right. So how can we estimate this price of anarchy? This is how things stand now. We don't know our own cost functions because we just instinctively drive. We don't know the origin destination of parts. We don't have actually a demand model for the transportation network. This is a little bizarre because the first thing that you want to do when you want to deal with a resource contention systems, you want to have a demand model. But we don't, because nobody tells me or anybody where they want to go or where they come from. Okay? You see people driving in links, but you don't know where this car came from or where it wants to go. Now, in principle, that can be done. We can ask people where you come from, where are you going, or you can use Google Maps type of information. But actually, the estimation problem of estimating where people come from, where they go, the OD estimation problem, is a very hard problem mathematically. Perhaps one of the more challenging problems associated with transportation systems. So, given these two major obstacles, we don't have cost functions and we don't have a demand model, how can we solve an optimization problem to define system optimality? Looks helpless. However, therefore we can't exploit automation. Okay? And we cannot go to the investors and say, because the price of anarchy is so high, you should invest in connected automated vehicles and so on. So what do we have? We have plenty of data. So the hope is go inverse, use the data, and estimate these unknown quantities. And we have done that. We have done that for a sub-network, because this is really a little too big to start out with. We have all this information. It's a humongous data set. It goes back to the year 2012. We now have some new data from 2015. And the backward optimization idea is use the data that reflect the current equilibrium and estimate these unknown virtual cost functions which best fit the data. That's why it's called inverse. Once you're done with that, that concludes the backward step. From the data, estimate the cost functions. Now go forward. Now that you have some cost functions, use what you know about optimization and solve a, actually not too hard, once you have all the information, optimal traffic flow or routing problem, which delivers the social optimum. And then you can estimate the price of anarchy. So I'm just going to show you how we estimated the price of anarchy. For this subnetwork, we actually have done it for bigger ones, but this was the original one for which I have some data. So you can estimate for every link here. You see this is pretty typical cost function as a function of the flow. And I want to show you the results. So these are results correspond to various links in this network. Why I'm showing you these results is because I want to emphasize the differences between the current condition, the red. So if you look at this, these are real data here for this particular link. So this is the average current cost function, the delay to this link, as opposed to the green, which is the optimum, the way that we calculate the social optimum. So if you focus on some of the ones that I showed you here, you see gaps. In fact, the gaps are not always one way. Here, the red is above the green, here the green is above the red. But this is immediately a telltale sign. Something is wrong here. There's big gaps between what is happening and what should be happening. Therefore, there must be an opportunity to do better. Given that, when you lump everything together, this is the typical price of anarchy curve for an entire month, the entire month of April, for the afternoon period in 2012. So this is one. You see, the best you can do is one. We never achieved it. But the important thing is what's happening up here. the actual price of anarchy is very often more than 2. What does that mean? It means that you can benefit, you can reduce traffic by more than 100% if you were able to tell people where to go, or tell the cars where to go and leave the people out. So that's the motivating part. Use disconnected, automated vehicles to bring this price of anarchy down. So how can you do that? The goal 1, which was the estimation of price of anarchy, we have accomplished it, and we have provided the evidence that indeed there is a high price of anarchy. So how can we now reduce or eliminate it and go from price of anarchy to a world where we all communicate, exchange information, and lovingly reach the social end? Well, when it comes to routing, I would say this is relatively easy, because you can already use recommendations, suggestions, and tell people where to go, which actually we do already, so we're kind of getting there. You can create incentives, pricing schemes, all sorts of economic mechanisms, which might sometimes work very well. And also, you can completely override and eliminate the driver by enforcing complete automation, full automation. The driver is not even in the picture. He enters his car, he says, I want to go there, and then the car takes over. Of course, the driver can override this, but ideally you could do that. So in principle, the routing problem seems relatively easy. What's hard is the choke points of a transportation system, typically intersections. Okay? Those are the bottlenecks. If you know anything about resource contention systems, you always look for the bottlenecks. And the bottlenecks will be the intersections or merging points and so on. So we want to concentrate in those points and see what we can do. So I'm going to tell you now about a decentralized, emphasis on decentralized, optimal control framework for letting all these vehicles go through this contention point without any traffic lights, but simply allowing each car to automatically control its velocity acceleration by communicating with a limited neighborhood of the multi-agent system, just like I was talking about yesterday. So let's see how we can do that. First of all, there's a lot of people that have talked about the so-called vehicle coordination problem. I'm not going to spend, again, time about that. If you're interested, you can take a look at the slides and identify all these people. I just want to point out this is a problem that was looked at way back in 1966. There was a paper that actually looked at this problem from a control point. So it's really not a new problem per se. And now there's a lot of groups around the world that are working on these problems with different points, different levels of success. I've highlighted this because this is a group in Michigan that I'm working on a particular project. And M-City is to my knowledge, the only realistic test bed that we have in the United States to test all of the self-driving cars with real cars. So I'm involved in a project to do that, and I'll tell you a little bit about that later. Okay, so let's get to it. We're going to proceed now by trying to come up with a mathematical model of an intersection, vehicle dynamics, control constraints, feasible controls, see if we can create a mathematical framework. So this is an intersection, and this is what we call the control zone. So this is just a region that you define within which the cars come under your control. Okay? There is a coordinator, but he or she is not a controller. The coordinator does not control. The role of the coordinator is simply to perhaps collect data and then disseminate it, but the coordinator does not control. Okay? So here are some cars approaching, and one of them enters the circle first, and we call this guy number 1. So we're going to create a queue, a first in, first out queue, based on who enters first. So as we go forward, we have number 2, number 3, and so on and so forth, and eventually they have to cross. Okay? If we have 2 intersections, perhaps even very close to each other, like the real-life example that I was showing you, we can extend things, and it just becomes very complicated. But there are 2 control zones, as you can see, and in the middle there's something that we call the merging zone. So remember, control zone is the bigger area, and merging zone is the place where you can have collisions. All right, the model. my vehicles, my agents, are going to be modeled in this way. Okay? This is a double integrator model, and I'm going to have them under my control from the minute that one of them enters the control zone until it leaves the merging zone. Now you can argue that perhaps this is too simple a model. I myself, when I started working with this, I wasn't sure. I was talking to all these car specialists to give me a more interesting model than that. But basically they tell me this is good enough. So I'm going with it. My control is going to be the acceleration, by the way. All right. So we have constraints. Obviously you cannot accelerate more or less than these two values, and you cannot speed up more than this and less than that. So these are control and state constraints, which always make life more difficult, but they're there. Okay, I already talked about the point where I enter the control zone and the point where I exit the merging zone. There's one more critical time, the time when I enter the merging zone. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to try to control the motion of the vehicle that entered here and exited there, because in the merging zone, as I'll show you in a minute, I'm going to assume for now that the speed stays constant. It's a very conservative approach, but let's go with that for now. So there is a zone, control zone Q, indicated by 1, 2, 3, 4. You see people come from different directions, but the time at which they enter defines this Q. And we will impose this order constraint, which means that if number 4 arrived before number 5, the number 4 must also arrive there before number 5. That's pretty obvious here because they follow each other. But here, number 1 must arrive before number 6, for example, or before number 2. Okay. So we preserve this order. So the first criticism that you should immediately throw at me is that FIFO is a hard constraint, and it is. But I want to emphasize that this is not really a strict FIFO constraint. Why? Because whenever a new vehicle arrives, I can always resolve my problem and reestablish a new order. And we've done that very recently, so I'm not going to show you results on that. So for now, we're going to work with just the assumption that there is this FIFO order, and I'm not going to try to reorder vehicles, but we can do that, and it does benefit. There's no question about it. So FIFO is a conservative approach. All right, so that's an order constraint that we impose for cars arriving at the merging zone. Next, we'll make an observation, which has to do with topology. When vehicle I arrives, and this vehicle looks at the predecessor, so let's say number 4 arrived, and it looks at number 3. So there's 4 possibilities in terms of the relative location. The first possibility is that they are at the same road, they go in the same direction, but in different lanes. So there's not going to be any conflict. The second possibility is that they're in the same road and the same lane, like 4 and 5. The third possibility is that they're on different roads and there could be a possible collision. So an example would be this way, 6 and 3. They could collide, go this way. And the last case is same road, opposite direction, no collision, because number 3 and number 4, for example, they just go past. So the interesting cases are the ones where there could be a collision, and we're going to have to worry about that. A few assumptions for now. No turns. I'm going to force all of my vehicles to go straight, but we've overcome that, and I'll show you some results later. And this assumption that when you enter the merging zone, you just simply cruise. Okay? You don't try to get too smart there, you just simply maintain a constant speed. This is also a little conservative, but for now, it's not a bad assumption. So let's go with it. Safety constraints, very important. Number 1, we don't want any rear end collision. So if for every I reserve the subscript k to denote the car physically in front of me, I am going to restrict the distance between these two vehicles to a safety distance called delta. Again, I'm told by the traffic engineer experts that this is actually not the best way to impose safety constraint, but a better way is to make this constraint a function of your speed. Because you're going too fast, then you're going to have to slam the brakes very hard. So you want to impose such a constraint that depends not just on distance, but actually on the derivatives. we can do that, but for now, we're going to work with that. The argument being that since in an intersection, these cars don't move very fast anyway, the problem of having to slam on your brakes, which you see in a highway, is not likely to occur in an urban setting. The second is, of course, the lateral collision. We don't want these two cars to collide, so we'll impose a constraint that basically you cannot occupy this physical space at the same time. Okay, this is the optimal control problem formulation in terms of energy minimization. We'll call it E-min, where we want each of these caps to minimize its energy cost. Energy is measured as the square of the acceleration here, and the optimal control problem is to control this acceleration from the point you enter the control zone, which is known, along with your speed, and I'm going to control you up to the point in time where you reach the merging zone or you exit the control zone. That is unknown. Okay? It is unknown. What are the constraints? The cap dynamics that I told you about, the speed acceleration constraints, disorder constraint, the rear end safety constraint, the lateral collision avoidance constraint. The terminal conditions, the boundary conditions, are the time at which you enter, which is 0 in appropriate defined axes, and the time at which you exit, which is the distance, known distance, from entry point to exit point. So this is the mystery variable. I told you that it's unknown. So this is, for those of you who know optimal control problem, this is an optimal control problem with an unspecified terminal time. So how are we going to determine this? We're going to, so this is just simply for notation that obviously in order for me to solve this problem, I have to define a feasible control set for this. I didn't specify this. Normally when I write rigorous mathematical papers, I always say UI of t belongs to some set. And this is the set, okay, just to be strict. But now I'm going to tell you about how I'm going to determine the merging time, the time that I reach the merging zone. The way I do that is by defining a maximum throughput problem. So in this solution, first we make sure that we maximize throughput, and once we do that by specifying the terminal time, then we minimize energy. So first maximize throughput, then minimize energy. There are alternative formulations where you combine those two criteria, and we've done it, and the results actually are not very different. So it seems that it's pretty robust in terms of how you formulate the problem. But anyway, the throughput maximization problem is essentially one in which you try to minimize the sum of the time distances between successive vehicles. Or, if you prefer, if there are n vehicles in this queue, you want to minimize the last one leaving minus the first one leaving, so the throughput time. Okay? So that's the throughput maximization problem, subject to all the constraints, including the fact that I can only control my accelerations within the feasible set. How do we solve this problem? Well, this is the solution of it. Obviously, I'm not going to go into the details. But what is important about the solution is that it is recursively determined. The optimal, throughput optimal, ith terminal time is given in terms of I minus 1 or k. Information, never mind the details. I mean, these are simple equations, but the important thing is that if you want to maximize your throughput, the only information you need is the optimal terminal time of the I minus first vehicle or the one physically ahead of you. This is a max, so I need to know both. But that's it. That's why this becomes decentralized. If you want to think of it as a multi-agent system, the neighborhood is defined by the guy that got the last index, the I minus 1, plus another index k, which obviously must have been there, so it's less than I, which defines the physically ahead of you vehicle. Given that, and these are just some physical constraints, because obviously you can't go super fast, and sometimes you're infeasible, so we put the physical constraints. Given this, we know that we can, in principle, decentralize. That's really the idea here. And this is just this EIC that shows here is sort of like a physical upper bound. That's all that this means. Physically. So the same lane, same direction, can't hit you. Okay. So, in higher level terms, I'm done. I have formulated my minimum energy problem, the E-min problem, after I have determined the terminal time through a throughput maximization. So the optimal control problem that you see here has been converted into a fixed terminal time optimal control problem because this has been fixed by another optimization problem. So now I am subject to all those constraints. I am done. The rest is math. Can I solve this problem? The answer is yes, and I can solve it also in a decentralized fashion. So I have to tell you exactly what each vehicle I needs, what we call the information set. Let's see. I need the position of myself, I'd better know that, the speed of myself, I'd better know that, and the relative distance, to answer your question, between the physically in front of me car. If there's no car in front of me, this is not me. So I need a proximity measurement. I need to know that. This leaves 1, 2, 3 more quantities. W is just a unique ID that's where this coordinator comes into play. Okay, so that's just logistics. Qi is one of the sets that I mentioned earlier that tells you topologically what is the relationship between me and I minus 1. So I need information through the coordinator that tells me, okay, I am number 4. About number 3, where's he coming from? Just tell me the set that he belongs to. That's where the coordinator comes in. But again, this is the I minus 1 information, so only one other vehicle. That leaves this, and this I already told you. It's the solution of the maximization, throughput maximization problem, which is obtained by I, him or herself alone. So, the information set available to I with the help of the coordinator is limited to only I and K. There is some communication that's needed. That's a technology problem that the only thing I can tell you is that people are working on it furiously. There's something called DSRC, I forget what it stands for. Maybe some of you know, but short range communication. What's the D? Direct? Something. Yeah. Anyway, so we need some help from the communication folks. No, only I minus 1. Yeah, because of this theorem. To obtain this, I need, well, this is the initial condition. So this is just 1. I need something from I minus 1 or K, which is the physically ahead. Everything else that you see depends only on I minus 1 or K. Actually, this is the only place where K comes in, or this constant. This is just a physical constant. So it is fully recursive. Okay, so there we are. And going back to my decentralized problem, I've got to solve this decentralized problem, knowing now this, because this has been determined by TP max. But if you remember earlier, I had more constraints which I removed. Removed a couple of constraints. Let's talk about those. The lateral collision avoidance constraint, in other words, the constraint that I will not hit laterally vehicles in the merging zone, is already taken care of by the fact that I've determined this Ti M star. This was determined under the ordering constraint, so I'm never going to allow two vehicles to be in the merging zone at the same time. Again, it's a conservative approach, but it's very, very safe. So that leaves the rear end safety constraint. That I can only guarantee at the terminal time. This is where the difficulties of optimization, constraint optimization, come into play. In particular, in dynamic optimization problems, I need to guarantee my constraints over the entire interval over which I'm optimizing. It's not easy. I cannot guarantee that. Okay? So that alone is a big hole that would say, what? You can't guarantee that we're not going to, bump into each other? What good is this theory for?
So why is this? That would be another state of constraint.
Yeah. So you have to do that. You have to impose. There are ways to do that, but it's hard. That's all I'm saying. I've eliminated it here because it's hard, and I will tell you how to take care of it now. Obviously, I wouldn't be here if I couldn't handle this. But it's hard. All I'm trying to say is that this is one of the difficulties that people ignore. The reason I'm emphasizing it because I actually see a lot of papers from people who solve these problems, and they don't appreciate it. They give it to some solver on the internet, something, and sometimes it works. Actually, if you're lucky, it's going to work, but sometimes you violate the constraint, you don't even know it. And so I'm cautioning you, as I'm cautioning myself, that you have to be careful, right? So I've got to guarantee that this constraint, the safety constraint, is never violated, which I'm not in this formulation, and I'll tell you how to handle it. So for the time being, let's ignore it, but actually I want to show you, it's an example of how it can get violated. It can be kind of tricky. So this is time, and these are two consecutive cars, 2 and 3, and this is that relative distance. If this is the safety distance, notice that when 3 arrived out here, it was okay. It was above the safety distance, so the constraint was satisfied. Something happened here, and I went under it, so I'm violating it until here where I can provably show you that it's always satisfied. So if I'm not careful, I could be operating 2 and 3, and here we come collide. Okay. Now, of course, you can argue that in the real world there are proximity sensors, and somebody will hit the brakes and it's not going to happen. But as a optimal control person, I'm not very happy that I cannot protect you from that. So I've got to deal with this problem, okay? And it's very easy to generate a scenario where it happens, like in this case. Okay? Put that aside for a minute, and let's see how to solve this optimal control problem. It is surprisingly easy to solve. If you ignore the constraints, it turns out that the optimal acceleration is a linear function of time, the optimal speed is a quadratic, and the optimal distance traveled is a cubic. So that's really pretty easy to solve. In addition, these coefficients, A, B, C, D, can be fairly easily obtained from this system of linear equations. So the unconstrained problem is actually surprisingly easy. The constraint problem is not that easy, but it can be done. It's just a pain in the neck. You know about optimal control theory, you got to look at the interior point constraints, stitch singular arcs. It's a little bit of math, but it's not that hard. And actually, we've done it in a paper that was recently published. So now I have to go back to this issue and tell you a little bit more about it because that's kind of important. Well, throughout is the important thing. We have a theorem where we provide necessary and sufficient conditions for this condition to hold throughout the control zone, which depends on the initial conditions. So think about it intuitively. Since I cannot control how the next car arrives, let's say we take cars 1 and 2. 1 has just come in, and 2 comes super fast and really close. So in the first epsilon time units within the control zone, there's no way that I can guarantee that the safety constraint is preserved because it wasn't just before I entered the control zone, and I cannot instantaneously force this guy to brake or the front guy to accelerate. So you can see why it's relatively easy to violate this. But we have come up with explicit analytical conditions, and they look like this. You can plot the initial speed versus the initial time, and you can identify a feasible region and an infeasible region. And this is the boundary. The boundary is not linear. It sort of looks linear, but actually it's not. And you can see the intuition. If you come very, very close after me and with very high speed, I cannot guarantee the safety constraint. It's impossible. So at least every time that somebody comes, I can, because I know the initial conditions, I can decide if I'm in the feasible region or not. If I am, no problem, my solution is guaranteed to hold. If I am not, then we have developed this concept of a feasibility enforcement zone. We put another ring around the control zone, and without applying optimization, we simply worry about controlling you to slow you down, to put your initial conditions when you get from here to there within the feasibility region. And we do essentially a worst case analysis. There are some specific conditions that you can determine. And here's the other way to get around this issue. If you do arrive, say you're number 2 and you arrive, and I find that you are in the infeasible region. Here's what I would do if I'm an engineer. I turn off the optimal control. I will say, okay, no optimal control, just drive safely. That's the best I can do. Okay, so that completes this analysis. Now I can show you what happens when you go from the before to the after with what I just described. Now you can sort of see, look carefully, that this guy slows down a little bit, the other guy slows down. So sort of let everybody go through. That's really the idea. And of course, if it works well. Okay. It's also a win-win-win solution. Win on the energy side, these are just empirical results, because you can see that I can reduce the energy consumed. Energy in terms of this quadratic of the acceleration by about 40%. The average throughput also improves. The average travel time is reduced by about 30%. And it seems that these are the magic numbers. It's always between 30 and 40% that these improvements arise. And because you reduce energy, you also reduce emissions. So if I had another function to measure the emissions, you would see that it would be a function that the more I save here, the more I save there. A quick comment about the fuel consumption. Is U squared really a good... Oh, my battery is running low. Okay, let's see if I can... the question that arises sometimes is this a good measure, U squared of fuel consumption? I've looked and I've talked to a lot of people, and I hear different answers from everybody. So what we have done is, after we come up with our optimal control solutions, we go to these very elaborate, detailed software packages that people have developed to measure real fuel consumption, and we can actually measure these curves more accurately. And it looks like, they're not, the U squared metric actually is not very good, as it turns out, but there's still an improvement of that order of magnitude anyway. Okay, let me quickly, in the last 5 minutes, tell you a little bit about the extension. So first of all, can you do left and right turns? Yes, you can. It's a pain, because now there's all these extra scenarios. The topology becomes more complicated. So if I allow left and right turns, there are more sets that I need to define, okay? So, for example, there's this set, which says that if cars like these come together, they could collide at the exit of the merging zone, and so on. So I need to define those. But if I define those, I can define additional constraints, which are translating to the exit time from the merging zone. So we impose those. Then, no longer can I force my vehicle to move through the merging zone at constant speed. That makes no sense, because I'm turning. So then there are formulas that you can find that define how you can turn. And this is sort of the, I guess, what they call the radius of turn, the turn radius, which you can see depends on the turning angle, depends on the elevation, friction, and so on. And there's a formula. Okay, there's a formula. You can calculate this. And this is the case where you go straight, in which case we still move at constant speed. So that creates an additional constraint that says I need to calculate this quantity and add it to my terminal time in order to take into account the turns. The way we handle the turning process is we recognize that now comes into the picture the factor of comfort, driver comfort. And comfort is usually measured in terms of what is known as jerk, which is the derivative of the acceleration. And I didn't really believe that very much until I got into a self-driving car in China last June, and I was in the rear car, and we were moving, and then they engaged their automatic system, and I almost went through the window. And that's when I decided that... this is the... Okay, I have 5 minutes left according to my automated timer here. So this is what we're doing. We're going to try to minimize the jerk. So we formulate the optimal control problem in this way, where you see there is an energy component and there is a jerk component. And as I get deeper and deeper into this area, I find that no matter what problem you solve in this car business, there are three objectives: energy, throughput, and comfort. So whatever problem we formulate, these are the three components we need to worry about. Here, because we've already maximized throughput, when we solve the problem, we worry about energy and jerk. When we solve this problem, there's still an issue of determining now a final speed. I'll skip that, we can do it. This is what the analytical solution looks like. It's not as easy as before, but it's analytical. It's still tractable. There's some exponential, but you can do it. So it's surprising to me that you can formulate these seemingly hard optimal control problems, and actually they work pretty well analytically. Of course, there's all sorts of it, yeah.
So this solution is the other countries.
That's okay.
Yeah, I mean, for tracking us. So, but this I don't do.
What's that? This?
This I don't do. It's no feedback.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Yes. Aha. Yeah, good point. Let me return to that if we get to the question. Yes. Yeah. So actually, this is, I was going to say, there's issues like computational cost, noise, cost, and so on. And this is where event-driven methods come in, and we think that we can deal with this issue in this way. But yes, so I may have to recalculate some of these coefficients as I move through the intersection, but it's an issue. All right, you can do trade-offs between comfort and energy. This is like a Pareto effect here. So once you do that, I can collect all sorts of data that are kind of hard to interpret. But when you see the squiggly curves, these come from curves. So that's when we lose this linearity of the control. What I wanted to show you is this simulation, which is very recent. This is actually using SimEvents, which is a discrete event and hybrid system simulator that works within Simulate, MathWorks. And I have to do this because I have a project with MathWorks, and I am forced to use now their products. And look at how poor this visualization is. I hope there's nobody here from MathWorks. But, I mean, that's all I can do. I can't even draw little cars. At least I can put some colors. Everything works well, but I can see that if you look carefully, there's some acceleration and deceleration taking place just so that they just don't hit each other. But one of the things that I hope the MathWorks folks will improve on, and they know, is visualization. Because this is pretty basic, right? But it works. Okay, so how do you test these things in the real world? Well, this is the semi-real world. This is my laboratory in Boston. And what we do is we create urban scenarios. These are intersections. These are traffic lights. In this particular experiment, we're calling traffic lights. These are little, very cheap robots. Very cheap, like $150 each. Where you can put on some communication and computation resources, and we control them along the lines of what I showed you. But this is how you test, for example, you don't collide, things like that. This is the real world. So this is M-City. It's a University of Michigan campus. It's got this straightaway, which is sort of like a highway. And this is the city. And in the city, there's just about everything you can encounter in a real city. So there's like a big rotary here, there's another little rotary there, and here you can't see very well, there's sort of like a block. And our job now is to instrument this Audi A3 e-tron plug-in hybrid with all these algorithms that I showed you and more, so that we can go to M-City sometime, hopefully next spring, and this will be fully automated. We're working with Bosch, and the Bosch people promise us that they will put all of our algorithms in there so that you can get in, push a button, and it will take you through all of this city without collisions, without hitting other vehicles. We will have other vehicles, by the way. So this will be an example where we are the smart vehicle and everybody else is the dumb vehicles. And by the way, to get the dump vehicles, you need to pay this expert driver. So they come in with cars, and then you pay them to just drive around doing nothing. That's a fun job, right? To just drive around. I guess the idea is that if this goes bad, they could get killed. But still, it sounds like a good job to me. Anyway. So, let's see. To conclude, these are some of the issues that come up. So the computational complexity has to do with, can you really do this decentralized control in the car? So far, really, we haven't had any problems. These things run very, very fast. There are issues of robustness and so on, but those are the obvious research directions to follow. Multiple intersections, I think we can handle that. Alternative formulations, we can do it by creating sort of complex combinations of travel time, fuel efficiency, and all that. We can do it. You see very minor changes. Relaxed FIFO. So I mentioned how this is a constraint. So we recently were able to do that by developing a dynamic resequencing mechanism. So every time a new vehicle arrives, you kind of reorder the cars that are still moving in an optimal way to maximize the throughput. And you do find significant improvements, no question about it, so that's nice. The open questions, for those of you who are interested in this area and you're looking for things to study, this is a big one. It's called the penetration rate question. What fraction of these nice cars do we need before we can actually realize benefits? Is it 1%, 2%, or 99%? How do we integrate pedestrians and bicycles? So when I give this sort of talk, I get a lot of questions, and there are two top questions that I get, and this is the number one, and this is the number two. So in places like Boston, where there's a lot of bicycling going on, there's always somebody in the audience with a bicycle, a freak, and they always ask me about, what about bicycles? How can you ensure the safety? So that's a good question. How about pedestrians? I think that's an even better question, because I don't really like to bicycle in cities, but I do like to walk in cities. So as a selfish person, I would like to solve this problem. So we have some ideas. I'm not going to tell you, but I think we have some good ideas about it. In principle, it's just another flow. Instead of having just cars, you have a different entity called person, and they move differently. So instead of satisfying the second integrator dynamics, to satisfy some different dynamics, once you get that in there, you can do it. But this is another interesting question. What if we allowed cars to be shared and use on-demand shared mobility? And this is motivated by this very interesting statistic. From a point of view of investment, your car is one of the worst investments that you make in your life, because you're using 4% of the time. Moreover, even though I'm working on smart cars and all that, I think I've convinced myself that no matter how smart you make the cars, you're still not going to solve the problem. In fact, there's a hidden feedback loop, because currently there's a lot of people, the so-called millennials, who don't even like driving. They don't have a driver's license, they don't care about cars. All right, one reason is because it's not very pleasant to drive. Now, if we make it pleasant to drive, with nice cars where you get in, you press a button, gets you your destination safely, you read your email, you sleep and all that, and we make it affordable, then they're going to start buying cars. So actually, we're going to increase the number of cars and we're going to bring it back into the system, even though we squeeze down, effectively increasing the capacity. So it looks hopeless. So my conclusion is the only hope to solve our transportation problems is to take cars off, period. So if you can take cars off by sharing cars and creating nice on-demand apps that the millennials will like, then you solve the problem, because you remove half the users. So we need to study this. I'm beginning to study these issues of shared mobility, because they're nice problems in terms of scheduling and how do you do it and so on and so forth. I just wanted to show you some preliminary results of this idea of penetration rate. Okay? How many cars does it really take to realize the benefit? So this is for my intersection environment. And it's a tough plot to understand because it's 3D. So there is, in this case, fuel consumption at the bar heights. This is the penetration rate by going this way, from 0 to 100%. And this is traffic volume, because that matters. So if you look at the very front, this is increasing the penetration rate of CAS from 0, in other words, the current conditions, to 100%. So you see that energy goes down nicely. This is traffic light control. This is interesting because at some point, actually having traffic lights is a good idea. Mainly back here. Because if you exceed a certain traffic volume, all you do is you just create an impossible congestion. The only way to resolve is with a traffic light. At some point, you turn a light red for some people, and you decongest. So it's kind of disappointing, frustrating. So you do all this work, and then you realize that beyond a certain point, actually, you can see here, the TLC line is better than anything else, even with 100% cap penetration. This is the same picture just to emphasize this traffic volume importance. There is a critical point at which you go from significant improvement, 60%, around 40%, down to actually doing worse. So that's kind of disheartening. And this is just the same thing, just to show you traffic light controls up here in terms of fuel consumption, 100% caps, and you have a nice benefit. But again, it depends very much. The reason I show this is because you need some time to reach steady state. So I want to convince myself that these solutions will reach steady state. And oh yeah, this is the usual thank you slide, which ends the show. Thank you very much.
Do we have any questions, comments? Thank you, Christos.
No, in Cyprus we love roundabouts. So I was wondering, does it make a difference if you use the roundabout strategy as opposed to?
So from a queuing theoretic standpoint, the roundabout is the most efficient way to control traffic. The problem is that there's humans in there.
No, but if you apply this strategy on the roundabout,
Yeah.
sort of.
If you apply a roundabout, you have to, it's an easier problem relatively, because instead of having an intersection, you have sort of simpler intersection, merging and exiting. Yeah, you can do that. We're working with the merging problem. Yes, you can do it. And if you can do it, actually, I think that would be nice, because the roundabouts are really the most effective way to route traffic. But also the least effective from a human point of view. In some cases, people don't know who has the right of way, so you get access. But it is a very effective way.
Somehow, this one question. Are they able to change lanes?
Lanes, yeah. Not in this setting, no lane changing. So they stick the same lane. You can impose that, they're automated. The minute they enter the control zone, you can tell them you cannot change lanes for simplicity. That's not a very good idea, because you can obviously do better by allowing them to change lanes. So now you have to solve another problem. The optimal lane changing problem with passing. Another optimal control formulation. We're working on that right now. I think that you can solve that as well automatically, but it's hard. It's hard. But in a congested area, think about it. A congested area in an urban setting, you really would rather not let people change lanes.
An intersection, yeah.
At an intersection.
Even now, even when humans are driving, you're not typically allowed to change lane in the intersection.
But if you go a little beyond urban, and there isn't a lot of traffic, it makes sense. I mean, if you have a guy in front of you that drives very slowly, why not pass him and make the green light, for example? And that's a separate problem. That's what I'm saying. Regardless of whether the intersection is signalized or not, the problem of passing is a separate automatic passing, self-driving.
And I didn't have a question with regards to the throughput maximization. The first problem that you solved there. I'm not convinced that because you mentioned that it's the time of the first car in the queue entering and the time of the last car in the queue entering, and then you just spread them in that time. All of the cars are spread in that time. So it's like balancing the cars along those,
Yeah.
along that time
You want
period.
to squeeze them down as much as possible within the constraints. Squeeze the distances,
Absolutely.
measure it in time units,
I thought like spread the distances in that time.
compress them.
Okay.
That's the secret, that you compress them as much as possible. However, you have a point. So some people, what they do is they interpret maximizing throughput as reaching a desired speed, so
Yes.
across the flow.
Yeah.
And you can do that by formulating the problem a little bit different.
Yeah.
The way that we do it is we put a quadratic cost between your speed and the desired speed of the intersection, which is your target throughput. And then you try to minimize the distance, the quadratic deviation. And the results seem to be similar. So we've tried several formulations. Once you get the first one, the others come relatively easily. And we haven't seen much of a difference, but I don't know for sure.
I was wondering about the effect of uncertainty. So when you have uncertainty in the different parameters in the position, for example, have you looked at
Another parameters than in the states.
Yeah, I mean, yeah.
Yeah, that's a big problem. So it goes back to what you're saying. So empirically, we have found that these solutions are fairly robust, but that's just simulations. One way to get around that is to take measurements and use some of these event-driven techniques so that if the deviation, the error from what you expect is greater than a certain threshold, then you recalculate. That's the solution. And as long as these problems are computationally efficient to solve, you can do that, because we're talking about milliseconds. The other thing that I would say, from a practice standpoint, is that you always want to have a lower level feedback loop, like the proximity sensor. So if my controller craps out, you're still going to stop. That's the best I can say. So you need for safety a few extra safety loops.
That's it. If it's from the rear car, if they are in opposite direction, then you have a bigger problem.
Well, opposite directions won't happen in an intersection unless they start taking angles, because essentially if they have turns, if they make turns, they will. But not really head on, more like lateral. Yeah, that can happen. That's one reason why we try to keep the speed at the merging zone constant, to avoid this, suddenly somebody or the control making a mistake and suddenly accelerating and creating a problem. But I don't know. I mean, simulations so far things work quite well. We have to go into the real world and see that. In the lab, we do get little problems like that. But in the lab, I think the problem is mostly because of poor communication. It's cheap robots. They don't communicate, they don't get information, so there's delays. So sometimes they don't get the information they need in time, and that's when you see them going like that. So, these are all problems.
I wanted to ask about the communication part. So now, I guess in the control zone, you assume like a range of communication. I think one problem that the cars may have, if the range of communication is not big enough, so they may not be able to communicate information, and they may end up colliding in the intersection. How do you handle that? Do you
It's even worse than that, because you can have attacks, hacking, that can take place, and you can have failures not because the range is not good enough, but because there's a failure. Transmitter failure. So this is, I don't know what to tell you other than that this problem exists now in all modern technology. It happens with your cell phone when you have a range, you rely on it, you're using it to take directions, suddenly it doesn't work anymore, you're lost.
So currently in the simulation, you assume that you do have the information, and what about the robots? Do they exchange information?
The robots are kind enough to create problems on their own. They're so cheap. That's why I like the cheap robots. There's problems all over the place. So then you get smart about dealing with those. But with the real world communication, I can tell you there's a lot of people working on this problem. There's a group in another university in the Boston area that I collaborate with that are working on that. And the amazing thing is how easy it is to hack a car. It's very scary, but hey, we've got to move forward anyway. So.
Any other questions?